If you're observing the stock ticker at this moment, you're seeing an event that finance experts insisted was impossible on mathematical grounds. You're seeing the core foundation of the North American economy split apart and devour billions of dollars live on screen. If you've got funds in a U.S. bank, if you own shares, or if you count on the international finance network to handle your home loan, you ought to take a seat and pay close attention, since starting this morning, the U.S. and Canada aren't simply battling a trade dispute involving aluminum and timber. They're waging an all-out, unlimited economic battle. And Donald Trump is right now losing it on an epic level. Only hours earlier, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took the single step the White House figured he'd never possess the outright courage for. He didn't merely impose counter tariffs on U.S. products. He didn't merely shut down a border point. He targeted the core of the American empire directly. Via an urgent order released by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in Ottawa, the Canadian authorities have formally halted the operating permits of every U.S. Schedule II and Schedule III bank functioning inside Canadian territory. Let me convert that from official finance terminology into simple, frightening English. Canada has just ejected Wall Street from its land. They've totally barred entities like JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America from handling fresh operations, settling deals, or shifting funds over the northern frontier. More than $113 billion in U.S. banking resources are now basically locked in a regulatory stranglehold. And Donald Trump, the person who sparked this conflict, is positioned in the Oval Office without any bargaining power to recover it. Over the coming few minutes, I'll guide you through precisely how this devastating breakdown in U.S. leadership unfolded. I'll reveal the precise tools Mark Carney applied to transform Canada's banking industry into an instrument of widespread economic ruin. I'll describe why Wall Street is now in a condition of complete uncontrolled alarm. And above all, I'll explain exactly how Trump's fixation on tariffs is set to render your existence much costlier. This isn't a practice run. The age of the U.S. setting the rules for the worldwide economy has just smashed into a solid barrier. To comprehend the full extent of this impact, you must review the sequence of occurrences that got us here this morning. For more than a year, Donald Trump has employed the U.S. economy as a crude weapon. He applied blanket 25% tariffs to Canadian shipments, arguing it would restore production to the U.S. He warned of imposing duties on Canadian power sources. He managed the biggest, most intertwined two-way trade partnership on the planet as if it were a bargain basement property deal. He figured he could pressure Ottawa till they caved. He followed consultants who assured him Canada's economy was basically an extension of America's, a reliant entity that would surely give way once the strain grew too intense. He deeply thought Canada depended on the U.S. more than the U.S. depended on Canada, but he hugely misjudged the individual facing him across the game board. Mark Carney isn't a reality TV personality. He's not a crowd pleaser who rules through midnight online outbursts. He's an internationally esteemed, extensively linked ex-central banker. He led the Bank of Canada. He led the Bank of England. He grasps the infrastructure of the global finance setup better than anybody in Trump's team. When Trump vowed to ramp up the tariffs this week, calling for absurd yields that would basically hand over Canadian economic independence, Carney didn't dash to the microphones to hurl slurs. He stepped into a conference room with the heads of Canada's major 6 banks. You need to grasp how dissimilar the Canadian banking setup is from the American one. The U.S. features thousands of scattered local banks. It's messy, spread out, and vulnerable to dramatic breakdowns. Canada boasts 6 huge, extremely secure, tightly controlled financial strongholds. Collectively, the Royal Bank of Canada, TD, Scotia, CIBC, and National Bank oversee trillions of dollars and hold a remarkable degree of combined organizational strength. Carney understood that while Trump concentrated on the transport of tangible items, vehicles hauling steel, rails carrying wood, conduits conveying oil. The actual weak spot of the U.S. was the transfer of funds. U.S. banks count on their Canadian units and outlets to support enormous company customers, to fund transborder vehicle part networks, and to settle billions in everyday global exchanges. It's a very profitable, fully linked circuit. So Carney just severed the link. The order released this morning calls upon national economic protection measures. It declares that because of the random and profoundly unsettling trade moves by the U.S. authorities, American finance entities are briefly denied their settlement rights. They can't manage Canadian dollar exchanges. They can't provide fresh business loans in Canada. The conduit of funds streaming from Bay Street in Toronto back to Wall Street in New York has been sealed tight. The instant repercussions are something you must observe to accept. Let's check the facts. Observe the dealing areas in Manhattan currently. The share values of the key U.S. banks are in total collapse. J.P. Morgan Chase by itself witnessed billions of dollars in market value erased during the initial 15 minutes of dealings. Why? Because shareholders abruptly grasped that the U.S. finance industry is no longer shielded from Trump's trade battles. For years, Wall Street supported, or at minimum put up with, Trump's bold trade approaches since the duties largely impacted the labor force. They impacted folks purchasing food and appliances. The financiers always figured their funds were protected. They figured the holy circulation of funds would never be disrupted. Mark Carney has just shown them incorrect. He hauled Wall Street right into the conflict zone. And the alarm isn't restricted to the banks. Reflect on the enormous U.S. companies that depend on those banks to manage their Canadian units. Reflect on Walmart Canada. Reflect on Ford and General Motors. Their salary distributions, their supplier settlements, their routine fund transfers are wholly reliant on those U.S. banking paths. With those paths obstructed, company finance managers are hurrying, urgently seeking to establish backup accounts with Canadian banks simply to maintain functionality. It's a coordination disaster of massive scope, purposely crafted by Ottawa to deliver utmost, precisely aimed distress to the U.S. contributor group. And how is the White House replying with total expected turmoil? Insiders in the West Wing report that Donald Trump was fully caught off guard. His trade consultants, the ones who promised him a trade battle with Canada would be straightforward to triumph, never planned for a case where Canada would arm its finance overseer. They were so fixated on 19th century notions like steel duties that they totally ignored the 21st century fact of economic combat. We're learning that the president used the morning shouting at his Treasury Secretary, insisting the U.S. strike back by taking Canadian banking resources in America. But here's the alarming fact that the White House is only now recognizing. They can't. If Donald Trump seeks to take the resources of TD Bank or RBC in the U.S., he'll set off a worldwide economic collapse. The Canadian major six banks are profoundly ingrained in the U.S. economy. They possess huge collections of U.S. business property. They offer essential cash flow to the U.S. local debt sector. If Trump strikes them, he doesn't merely wound Canada. He ruins the savings plans of millions of U.S. residents. He stops loans for U.S. small enterprises. It would be economic self-harm. And Mark Carney realizes it. Carney has basically created an economic fail-safe trigger. He's boxed Trump into a spot where any bold response from the U.S. will cause disastrous injury to the U.S. economy. This is the deep contrast between the pair of leaders. Trump reacts on whim, fueled by self-importance and a frantic desire to seem strong for his supporter base. He launches strikes without pondering the retaliation. Carney operates on tactics. He devoted months silently assessing the weak points of the American setup, pressure-checking the legal structures, and synchronizing his home organizations. When he ultimately took action, it wasn't a cautionary blast. It was a decisive victory. He didn't amplify his tone. He didn't share a furious outburst in uppercase. He simply serenely and systematically changed the oversight rules. And by that, he forced the strongest finance area on the planet to submit. This is what genuine guidance appears like during an emergency. It's composed, it's accurate, and it's totally merciless when defending country independence. But we must expand the perspective and consider the worldwide consequences of this, since the remainder of the planet is viewing this happen with amazement. For generations, the U.S. dollar and the American banking setup have served as the unchallenged core of international business. Nations put up with U.S. excess since the U.S. finance setup was regarded as the most secure, most reliable sanctuary worldwide. But by goading Canada into this unmatched step, Donald Trump has uncovered an enormous weakness in the shield of U.S. economic supremacy. Europe is viewing this. China is viewing this. The growing markets of the developing world are viewing this. They're noticing that the U.S. is so inconsistent, so undependable that even its nearest partner, its most thoroughly linked friend, was driven to break economic connections to shield itself. If Canada can't rely on the U.S., who can? We're already noticing the spreading impacts. Accounts are appearing that European central banks are discreetly initiating pressure tests on their own links to U.S. finance entities. Overseas shareholders are examining the disorder in Washington and wondering if it's really secure to place their funds in a nation whose leader handles international trade like a private feud. This is the unseen expense of America first. It wrecks the single element that really sustains the worldwide economy: trust. Mark Carney didn't merely halt a handful of banks today. He openly removed the U.S. of its reliability. And now we must connect this to you, the individual viewing this video, the individual pondering how a clash among tycoons and officials will influence your routine existence. You're going to sense this, and you're going to sense it shortly. When U.S. banks endure a huge strike to their financial statements, when billions of their resources are immobilized overseas, they don't simply take the hit, they shift it onto you. They're going to strengthen their loan requirements at once. If you're seeking a home loan next month, your borrowing rate will be increased. If you're attempting to secure financing for a vehicle, it's going to be more difficult to meet the criteria. If you manage a small company and require credit access to cover wages, the bank will view you with much greater doubt. Funds are going to scarce. The circulation of money that sustains the U.S. economy's momentum is going to tighten since the banks are abruptly scared of the international political danger produced by their own leadership. And then there's the price rise. Trump's duties were already pushing up product expenses, but this banking barrier is going to ignite the blaze further. Distribution networks rely on intricate credit documents and transborder funding to shift items. With those economic links demolished, the expense of bringing in anything from Canada, from the wood employed to erect U.S. residences, to the vital resources used in U.S. gadgets, to the power that energizes the U.S. Northeast, is going to soar. You're going to cover Donald Trump's self-importance each time you head to the tool shop. You're going to cover it each time you clear your warmth invoice. You're going to cover it each time you view your reducing retirement fund. The leadership will seek to convince you this is Canada's responsibility. They'll deploy their media reps to declare that Mark Carney is operating unjustly, that he's harming the U.S. laborer. Don't accept the distortion. Canada didn't begin this blaze. They simply created a barrier to halt it from consuming their dwelling. This emergency lies fully, entirely on Donald Trump's back. He forced an independent country to the utter limit, presuming they'd yield. He engaged in a standoff with a heavy vehicle, and now the U.S. economy is being flattened beneath the treads. So what unfolds over the next 48 hours? We're stepping into the riskiest part of this clash. Scenario A, the trading forces a yield. This is the outcome Carney is relying upon. The share market keeps falling. The heads of J.P. Morgan, Citi, and Bank of America proceed to the Oval Office and state to Trump without doubt that he needs to halt the trade battle right away. They push him to eliminate the duties and accept a degrading withdrawal pact just to release their Canadian resources. It would represent a full political setback for Trump, but it would protect the economy. Scenario B, the self-importance ramp up. Trump rejects retreat. His vanity won't let him concede he was bested by a Canadian leader. Rather than removing the duties, he intensifies. He strives to activate crisis authorities to curb the activities of Canadian banks in the U.S., overlooking the cautions from his own finance agency. If he proceeds, we're facing a complete global economic emergency. We're speaking of loan sectors stopping totally. We're speaking of a sharp, abrupt downturn that renders the 2008 economic failure seem like a practice round. It's guaranteed mutual economic ruin, and Trump could be erratic enough to initiate it. Scenario C, the lawmaking involvement. The U.S. commerce elite frets so intensely that they rebel against the leader. Congress, scared of meeting electors during an economic failure, warns of approving unbreakable laws revoking Trump's duty powers. It would divide the Republican group and spark a government emergency. But it could be the sole approach to grab the controls from a deranged person before the vehicle tumbles off the ledge. No matter what occurs, the myth of U.S. unbeatability has been broken. For the previous 100 years, the U.S. worked on the premise that it could impose conditions to the globe. It presumed its economic pull was so vast that no country could ever detach. Today, Mark Carney didn't merely detach. He switched off the pull. He showed that skill, planning, and organizational steadiness can beat boisterous, messy crowd appeal. He showed that a moderate nation working with exact sharpness can stop a major force entirely. As you see the negative digits blink on your display today, as you see the White House hurry to account for a catastrophe they fully produced, pose a single query to yourself. Who do you rely on for your tomorrow? Do you rely on the individual who manages the worldwide economy like a betting house, thoughtlessly wagering your living for a fast news flash? Or do you gaze upward to a figure who comprehends the calculations, who guards his populace, and who just performed the cleverest economic safeguard in recent records? The former global structure is gone, and Donald Trump is the one who ended it. Mark Carney is simply the figure drafting the death notice. This narrative is changing every moment. The exchanges are fluctuating, the official language is intensifying, and the economic outlook for North America is teetering on a fine line. The standard press will attempt to understate this. They'll present it as a regular trade argument. They won't reveal the facts on how poorly the U.S. just got surpassed, but we will. Be certain to join this channel at once. Press the alert icon, since when the following piece drops, when the actual expense of this banking restriction strikes the U.S. buyer, you're going to require knowing precisely what's transpiring and how to defend yourself. Post your ideas in the remarks section. Did Mark Carney just preserve Canada, or did he just shove the worldwide economy past the limit? And even more crucially, can the U.S. withstand an additional year of this disorder? I examine each individual remark, and I wish to know your viewpoint. Keep watchful, keep aware. History is unfolding at this instant, and you're part of it. We'll meet you in the upcoming report.